I never told this story to anyone other than my wife and my older brother, who is also a truck driver. Honestly, I still have a hard time processing what happened that October night last year, as I was taking my usual route from Denver to Salt Lake City. It was around 11 p.m., and I had my 2019 Peterbilt loaded with electronics. The radio was screeching more than usual that night, so I turned it off and drove in silence down I-70, thinking only about getting home soon to see my family. That's when I came across those damn construction lights and a warning that the road would be closed for the next 3 kilometers. I had already done this route hundreds of times, so I soon realized that I could take a detour along Highway 6, a secondary road that I knew well. It was dark as hell, and this alternative route wasn't as well lit as the main one, but I kept my normal pace, as there wasn't much movement at that time. After about 20 minutes on this detour, I saw something that made me instinctively slow down. A figure holding a sign. Normally, I would never stop. 15 years on the road taught me not to give rides, especially at night. But as I passed by, the headlights illuminated the sign that said, Price, Utah, and I saw that it was just an ordinary guy, probably in his 40s, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans, looking exhausted. Something about him seemed familiar, like he was someone I should know. Against all my common sense and the rules I had established to keep myself safe, I slowed down. Today, I ask myself every day why the hell I did that. I pulled the truck over to the shoulder, a few meters in front of him. In the rearview mirror, I saw the guy approaching calmly, with nothing strange about his behavior. When he opened the passenger door, a gust of cold wind entered the cabin along with him. He introduced himself as Mike and thanked him for the ride. The guy had a slightly different accent, which I couldn't quite identify. As I got back on the road, I started that basic truck driver conversation. Where are you going? Where are you coming from? That kind of thing. That's when things started to get weird. Before I even asked him anything about the route, he commented, "You must be excited to get home and see Sarah and the girls, right?" Especially after that phone argument about Amy's birthday party. I froze instantly. I had actually argued with my wife Sarah earlier about our daughter Amy's 10th birthday party. But how the hell could he know that? I tried to stay calm and continued driving, but my mind started working overtime. Maybe he had accidentally overheard some of my conversations on the radio, but I hadn't even used the radio that night. I tried to hide my discomfort and changed the subject, asking how long he had been waiting for a ride. Mike completely ignored my question and continued, John, I can call you John, right? After all, it's your name. At that moment, my blood ran cold. I hadn't introduced myself at any point. You always take this detour when there's construction on I-70. It's quicker than waiting, even though it's darker. My hands started to sweat on the steering wheel and I tightened my grip on the grip, trying to stay focused on the dark road. The silence inside the cabin became heavy, suffocating. Mike continued to sit calmly, as if there was nothing wrong with knowing such specific details about my life. Suddenly he turned to me and said, "You must be wondering how I know these things, right? Just as you must be wondering if it was a good idea to stop that night in Rollins to sleep." Even though I knew I was late with delivery, my heart raced. It was impossible for him to know about that stop. I hadn't told anyone, not even my boss. I had said in the report that I had a mechanical problem, not that I had stopped to rest because I was too exhausted to continue. I started to feel a ringing in my ears and that horrible feeling that something was very wrong. It wasn't normal. Couldn't be normal. Mike knew things that only I could know. Things I hadn't shared with anyone. The guy continued talking about details of my life as if he were reading an open book. He mentioned the brand of coffee I always bought at the stop at gas station 157. He talked about the name of my dog who had died 3 months ago. He even commented on the tattoo I had hidden from Sarah last month. With each of his words, I felt my stomach sinking deeper and deeper. The worst part was that there was no safe place to stop on that secondary road, and there were still at least 40 minutes to go until the next city. It was then that Mike started talking about things that hadn't even happened yet. John, you should call your sister Emma tomorrow. She's going to need you very much." At that moment, I felt such a strong shiver that I almost lost control of the steering wheel. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying not to show the panic I was feeling. He continued in that same calm voice. "Emma will discover that she has a lump in her right breast. It will be difficult at first, but she will overcome it, especially if she has her brother's support." I felt my face getting hot and sweat running down my forehead. I could no longer hide my nervousness. I tried to turn on the radio to break the ominous atmosphere, but only static came out, a high-pitched, uncomfortable hiss that seemed to make the situation worse. I decided I couldn't go on with it any longer. I needed to find a way to get rid of that guy. I said I was going to stop at the side of the road to check for a strange noise in the engine. A lame excuse, I know, but it was the best I could think of in that moment of terror. As I began to slow down, Mike let out a low laugh that chilled me to the bone. "There's no need to stop, John. In fact, you don't even need to worry. Pretty soon you won't see me here anymore." I quickly glanced at his side and noticed something that made me almost scream. Through the dim light from the dashboard, I could see that Mike seemed to be becoming transparent. It was as if he was there, but at the same time he wasn't. I could see the passenger seat through his body. I couldn't think straight anymore. My mind desperately tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening, but there was none. I squinted my eyes a few times, thinking that maybe it was tiredness making me see things. But no, Mike was still there, increasingly translucent, like an image that is slowly losing its clarity. The most disturbing thing is that he had that same serene smile on his face, as if gradually disappearing was the most natural thing in the world. "Do you know why I'm here, John?" he asked, his voice now sounding distant, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. "It's because you're going to go through the same stretch exactly 1 year from now. And on that day, you're going to need to make a very important decision. When that time comes, remember me." At that moment, I felt absurdly cold inside the cabin, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped by 20 degrees. The glass started to fog up and the truck's dashboard flashed a few times, making the speedometer oscillate wildly. I tried to keep control of the steering wheel while my heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. Mike was now almost completely invisible, but you could still hear his voice. "Oh, and John, that pain you've been feeling in your chest isn't just stress. See a doctor next week. Trust me." It was the last thing he said before disappearing completely, leaving only the empty bench next to me. The intense cold disappeared instantly. The dashboard returned to normal, and the radio started playing some music, as if nothing had happened. I drove the rest of the way in shock, barely able to process what had just happened. I got home that night and couldn't sleep, replaying every detail of that bizarre experience in my head. The next day, still shaking, I called Emma. She answered crying. She had just returned from the doctor, where she discovered a lump in her right breast, exactly as Mike had said. The following week, pressured by Sarah, who thought I was too pale, I went to the doctor. I discovered that I had a beginning of cardiac arrhythmia which, if not treated soon, could have caused me to have a heart attack. Everything that strange passenger had said was coming true, and that made me increasingly terrified. Today, it has been almost a year since this happened. Since then, I've been counting down the days, wondering what important decision I will have to make when I go through that stretch again. I've already thought about changing my route, getting another job, doing anything to avoid that place. But something inside me says I can't escape this. I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, in a cold sweat, remembering that translucent figure sitting in the seat of my truck. Emma is fine now, so is my heart, thanks to his warnings. But not a day goes by that I don't wonder, who or what was Mike really, and what will happen when this 1 year is complete. I only have 2 weeks left to find out, and honestly, I've never felt so scared in my life. I've been driving a truck for over 15 years, and I can say that I've seen a lot of strange things on the roads in the United States. But nothing compares to what happened to me in September last year, on a night that started like any other work night. I was doing my usual route from Chicago to Phoenix, hauling electronics. It was around 11 p.m. when I entered the small county of Lost Creek, Montana, a place you won't find on any tourist map. I was exhausted after driving for almost 14 hours, and my tank had already been blinking at reserve for a few miles. The GPS showed that there were still about 3 hours until the next decent gas station. So when I saw the faded Roy's Gas and Service sign on the side of the road, I didn't think twice about going in. The station was one of those very old ones, from the 50s or 60s, all stripped and with those vintage pumps that you only see in movies. There was a tiny convenience store attached, with a fluorescent light flashing at the entrance that hindered vision more than it helped. What caught my attention right away was the complete silence of the place. Normally, these roadside posts always have a cricket chirping or the sound of cars passing in the distance, but there it was a sepulchral silence that made my ears ring. I parked my navy blue Peterbilt 379 next to the pump and turned off the engine. The creaking of the truck door echoed in a way that made me feel like I had just announced my arrival to the entire city, even though I hadn't seen any sign of civilization in the last 40 minutes on the road. As soon as I got out of the truck, a guy appeared out of nowhere next to the pump, scaring the hell out of me. He was a thin man in his early 50s, wearing a worn-out uniform with the name Earl embroidered on the pocket. What bothered me most was not his sudden appearance, but his smile. It was too wide, too artificial, as if someone had stretched the corners of his mouth with staples. His eyes also had something wrong with them. They were such a light blue that they seemed almost white, and he didn't blink. Never. I stood there for a good 30 seconds, half hypnotized by that fixed look, until he said, "Fill up the tank, boss." His voice was strangely melodious for a man of his size, almost as if he was humming the words. I said yes, still trying to recover from the shock, and went to the store to buy a coffee while he got gas. The doorbell rang when I opened the door, but the sound was distorted, as if the battery was running out. The inside of the store was even more disturbing than the outside. The shelves were practically empty except for a few unlabeled cans of food and bags of chips covered in dust. The coffee came from an old machine that made a strange noise, as if it were breathing. As I waited for the dark liquid to drip into the styrofoam cup, I began to have that horrible feeling of being watched. You know when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you're absolutely sure someone is staring at you? That was it, only multiplied by 10. When I turned to check, there was no one there except me and the cashier, a freckled teenager who couldn't take his eyes off his cell phone, his fingers moving at an absurd speed on the screen, even though it was completely black. It was when I picked up my coffee and approached the counter that I noticed something even more disturbing. Through the store's dusty window, I saw a row of abandoned buildings across the street, 5 or 6 old brick buildings, all dark and seemingly empty. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to notice movement in the windows. At first I thought it was curtains blowing in the wind, but there was no wind at all that night. And then I saw it, eyes, dozens of them, glowing in the darkness like cats, all fixed on me. Some blinked in sync, others remained wide-eyed, but all, without exception, were facing the store where I was. I felt my stomach drop and spilled some coffee on my shirt, but I tried to stay calm. The cashier finally looked up from his cell phone as I approached to pay, and I almost dropped the cup again. Her freckles. They were moving. No, it wasn't me. They actually moved across your skin like tiny brown ants, changing position every second. And his eyes were exactly the same as the gas station attendant outside. That same almost white blue, that same disturbing fixity. That's $47.23 for gas, plus $1.50 for coffee, he said in a voice that seemed to come from far away, as if he were speaking through a long tunnel. As I picked up my wallet, I noticed that something was wrong with his hands too. His fingers were too long, as if they had an extra joint, and they moved in an uncoordinated way, almost as if each one had a life of its own. I swiped my card as quickly as I could, avoiding looking directly at those grotesque fingers. The boy continued to stare at me as the machine processed the payment, and now I could swear his freckles were forming patterns on his skin, circles, spirals, and other shapes that made me feel sick just looking at them. The machine made a strange noise, like a muffled groan, and spat out a receipt that looked like it had been burned around the edges. When I went to pick it up, the boy grabbed my wrist. His touch was cold and sticky. "Don't you want to get to know our city? We have very comfortable rooms at the hotel next door. Special prices for truck drivers," he said, still with that artificial smile. His voice now had a metallic echo that made my blood run cold. I tugged hard on my arm and mumbled something about being late for a delivery that I practically ran out of the store, the doorbell ringing that distorted sound again. Gas station attendant Earl was still out there, standing in exactly the same position, as if he hadn't moved an inch since I started pumping gas. But now there was something different about him. His skin seemed translucent. In the dim light of the station, I could have sworn I could see the veins pulsing on his face, but they moved erratically, as if they were carrying something much thicker than blood. The eyes in the windows of the abandoned buildings seemed to have multiplied, and now I could hear a low humming sound coming from that direction, as if dozens of people were whispering at once. But they weren't words I could make out. It was a more primal, more hungry sound. I got into the truck with my hands shaking so much that I could barely fit the key in the ignition. When I finally started the engine, the radio turned on by itself. I was sure I had left it off, playing some distorted old music that I had never heard before. It was a melody that seemed to come from an old gramophone, with a female voice singing words that made no sense in any language I knew. I tried to turn off the radio, but the button didn't work. It was then that I looked in the rearview mirror and my heart almost stopped. There were people coming out of abandoned buildings, dozens of them, all of them wearing old-fashioned clothes, as if they were straight out of the 50s, and all of them moving strangely, as if their joints were loose, their limbs swaying unnaturally as they crossed the street towards the gas station. The gas station attendant, Earl, was still standing next to the pump, but now his smile had gotten so wide that it seemed to split his face in half, and that dark thing I had seen pulsing under his skin was beginning to run out of the corners of his eyes like tears. Black. The people coming from the buildings were getting closer and closer, and in the gas station's fluorescent light I could see that there was something terribly wrong with their faces. They looked unfinished, as if someone had started shaping a wax mask and gave up midway through the process. Some had holes where their eyes should have been, others had skin stretched over empty sockets, and they all had that same impossible Earl smile. The boy from the store had left too, and his freckles were now literally popping out of his skin, falling to the ground like little brown bugs that began crawling toward my truck. I stepped on the accelerator, making the tires squeal on the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I saw the entire grotesque crowd moving in unison, as if controlled by a single mind, extending their deformed arms toward me. The radio began to turn up in volume on its own, and now the music had turned into something that sounded more like ritualistic chanting, with male and female voices overlapping in a shuffle that made my head pound. The gas station got smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror, but the lights seemed to follow me. It was as if the sickly glow of the fluorescent lights had taken on a life of its own and was spreading across the road behind me, turning everything it touched into shades of blue and green that shouldn't exist in nature. I drove like a madman for at least an hour, not daring to stop or even slow down, even when my tank started telling me it was on reserve again. The radio kept playing that infernal song, randomly increasing and decreasing in volume, and sometimes I could have sworn I heard distorted laughter between the voices. The GPS had stopped working completely. The screen only showed static, like an old TV going offline. But what was worse were the reflections I occasionally caught in the rearview mirror. Flashes of deformed faces appearing and disappearing in the trailer windows, dark spots that seemed to move on their own across the truck bed, and those damn blue-white eyes that seemed to sprout from the back of the truck. Nothing in the darkness and then disappear, as if they were playing with me. I only calmed down when I saw the lights of a big city on the horizon, Helena, capital of Montana. It was almost 3 a.m. when I finally stopped at a well-lit and busy gas station at the entrance to town. My hands were still shaking when I turned off the engine, and it was only then that I realized I was drenched in sweat. The radio had finally stopped playing that damn song, but when I looked at the speedometer, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The odometer showed that I had only traveled 20 miles since Earl Station. This was impossible. I had been driving for over an hour at over 100 per hour. It must have covered at least 150 kilometers. And there was more. When I went to check the fuel tank, it was completely full, as if I had never stopped at that station to fill up. The next morning, I tried researching Lost Creek and Earl's gas station, but found absolutely nothing. I asked other truck drivers, consulted old maps, searched internet forums. Nothing. It's as if that place never existed. The only proof I have that it wasn't a nightmare is the singed receipt the freckle boy gave me. But even that seems to be deteriorating, the letters becoming more and more blurry with each passing day. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up scared thinking I heard that strange song on the radio, or I see reflections of blue-white eyes in the mirrors in my house. And there's another thing. Since that night, every time I pass by a gas station after dark, I can swear I see freckles moving across people's skin, like tiny insects looking for a new host. I have been a truck driver for over 16 years and had never experienced anything like this until that night in October last year. I was taking my usual route from Denver to Salt Lake City, hauling a load of electronics. It was around 11 p.m. when I left the Flying J gas station on I-70. After drinking my usual black coffee and chatting a little with Joe, the gray-haired attendant who became my friend after so many stops there. The night was especially dark, with no moon, and that region of Colorado is known for having very isolated stretches. I drive a red Peterbilt 379, my faithful companion since I started working as a freelancer. That night, as usual, I was alone in the cab, listening to some Johnny Cash on the radio and keeping in occasional contact with other truck drivers on the CB radio. It was about an hour after resuming the journey that things started to get strange. The CB radio, which I always leave on channel 19 to communicate with other drivers, started emitting strong static that made me immediately turn down the volume. I thought it was just normal interference, the kind of thing that happens when you're passing through more remote areas. But then, in the middle of all that static, I started to hear voices. At first, they were very distorted, as if they had been put through a crusher, you know? I tried to adjust the frequency thinking that it might be a colleague trying to make contact, but the more I moved the controls, the clearer the voices became. But what they were saying didn't make any sense. It was a jumble of loose words, random numbers, and sounds that seemed almost non-human. I was intrigued, but not scared yet. After all, I had seen a lot of faulty equipment over the years. That's when those voices started saying things that made me freeze. Red Peterbilt, Colorado license plate JXK 4729, kilometer 264. It was exactly the data of my truck and my current location. My heart started pounding and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. How could anyone know these details? I thought about responding, questioning who was speaking, but something told me to stay quiet. The voices continued, now mentioning even more specific things. Black coffee at the Flying J. Talk to Joe. Johnny Cash on the radio. Everything I had done in the last hour. At that moment, I felt a chill running down my spine that not even the cabin heater could ward off. There was no way someone could be watching me so closely without me noticing. It was then that I noticed the lights in my rear-view mirrors. An older model black SUV, perhaps a 1990s Ford Explorer, had appeared seemingly out of nowhere and was following me at a steady distance. Normally, it wouldn't be a big deal. It's common to have other vehicles on the road, even late at night. But the way he maintained exactly the same distance without varying in the slightest felt unnatural. I tried to pay attention to the license plate, but it was too dark to identify, and his headlights, which seemed to have a greenish tint, made it even more difficult to see any details. The voices on the radio became more intense. He noticed. He's looking. Keep your distance. It was as if they were narrating my actions in real time. I decided to accelerate a little, just to see if I could get any reaction from the SUV. I increased it to 75 miles per hour, then 80, and that car was still there, as if it were tied to my truck by an invisible rope. The radio now had a different voice, deeper and clearer than the others. Speed tests started. Subject showing signs of nervousness. It sounded like a scientific report or something. My mind started spinning, trying to find rational explanations. Could this be some kind of disguised DOT inspection? But they never work like that, and those voices weren't normal. I tried to make contact with other truck drivers via CB. Breaker 1 to 9. Anyone listening? I'm having a strange situation here on I-70, but I only received static in response. It was as if all other frequencies had simply disappeared. I looked at my cell phone thinking about calling 911, but there was no signal. 0 bars. Precisely in that stretch where I normally get at least 3G. The truck's dashboard started acting strange too. The speedometer fluctuated for no reason. The fuel gauge jumped from full to empty in a matter of seconds, and the dashboard's GPS simply blinked and went out. The voices on the radio seemed amused by the situation. Electronic systems responding as expected. Proceed with next phase. Just then I saw a sign indicating that the next rest area was 5 miles away. I needed to make a quick decision. Stay on the road with that thing following me or risk a stop. I decided I needed to stop. Worst case scenario, there would be other people in the rest area. Truck drivers aren't exactly known for sleeping early. I signaled and started to slow down, my heart almost falling out of my throat when I saw the SUV do exactly the same. The voices on the radio became agitated. Unauthorized route change. Adjusting parameters. Initiating containment. That's when something even more bizarre happened. All the lights in the rest area, which were already visible in the distance, they suddenly went out, as if someone had turned off a giant switch. And it wasn't just the parking lot lights. Any sign of life or civilization within several miles simply disappeared, leaving only the absolute darkness of night and those greenish headlights behind me. Still, I continued towards the rest area. I didn't have much of a choice at that point. When I pulled into the driveway, I realized the SUV was gone. It simply disappeared, as if it had never existed. For a moment, I felt enormous relief, until I realized that the situation had become even stranger. The place was completely empty. Not a single truck, car, or person in sight, which is practically impossible at an I-70 rest area, even in the middle of the night. And there was more. The air seemed different, denser, as if the atmosphere itself had changed. My ears began to ring, and that static on the radio was replaced by a low, steady sound, almost like singing, but it wasn't anything that sounded human. It was as if the air itself was singing. I turned off the engine but kept the key in the ignition. I know it seems stupid to have stopped there, but something told me that continuing to drive would be even worse. The sound in the air grew louder and louder, and it started to make my teeth hurt. Suddenly, I saw something in the mirror that made me catch my breath. It was no longer one SUV, but 3, all identical, with those same greenish headlights, positioned in a perfect triangle around my truck. I stood transfixed, watching in the mirror as they slowly began to move in sync, twirling as if they were doing a macabre dance. The radio came back to life. Final sequence initiated. Subject isolated. Prepare for extraction. The voice now sounded almost excited. That's when I noticed a very bright light coming from above, reflecting off the sides of my truck. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't white like a normal spotlight, nor yellowish like road lights. It was a blue-green, pulsating light that seemed to be alive. The SUVs continued their synchronized dance, and the sound in the air had turned into something that made my head throb. I tried to start the engine, but it didn't even react. All of the truck systems were dead. Through the windshield, I saw that the light was descending, getting closer and closer, and with it came a buzzing sound so intense it felt like my brain was being liquidized. At that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw myself on the cabin floor and covered my head with my arms, as if that could protect me from whatever was happening. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The temperature inside the cabin suddenly plummeted, to the point where I could see my own breath in the air. That light now entered through all the cracks in the truck, and I could feel a kind of pressure, as if the air was being sucked out. The windows began to vibrate in a rhythm that seemed to accompany that supernatural song, and I distinctly heard the sound of metallic footsteps on the truck's bodywork. These were not normal footsteps. It was as if something very heavy was walking over the cabin, but with surgical precision. At that moment, the voices on the radio became a jumble of sounds, some in languages I had never heard before, others that sounded more like codes than words, all speaking at once. Theta setting activated, biomarkers confirmed, start of the containment sequence in 3, 2, suddenly, everything stopped. The silence was so abrupt that for a moment I thought I had gone deaf. The light went out, the temperature returned to normal, and when I finally found the courage to look up, the SUVs were gone. The parking lot was exactly as it should be at a normal rest area. A few trucks parked, drivers sleeping, a family van getting gas. The lights were all on, and I could even hear the distant sound of country music coming from the main building. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It had only been 7 minutes since I had entered the rest area. 7 minutes. It seemed impossible that all of this had happened in just 7 minutes. The CB radio was working normally, with typical truck driver conversations. My cell phone showed full 4G signal, as if nothing had happened. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had happened. My fingers shook as I picked up my cell phone to check if I had any records. Photos, recordings, anything. Nothing. But there was something different. On the truck's windshield, outside, there was a mark that made me freeze. It looked like a sequence of geometric symbols, as if they had been burned into the glass, glowing faintly in a greenish hue. I grabbed my flashlight and went out to take a closer look, but as soon as the beam of light touched the symbols, they began to fade, like ink dissolving in water, until they disappeared completely. It was the only physical proof I had that I hadn't imagined at all. I tried to photograph it before it disappeared completely, but in the photos only the normal glass of the windshield was visible. This happened 4 months ago, and since then I've been trying to find explanations or people who have gone through something similar. I changed my route, avoided driving at night on that stretch of I-70, and never heard those voices on the radio again. But a few things have changed. My CB radio occasionally picks up bits of static that seem to form patterns, even when it's turned off. Sometimes, when I look in the rearview mirror at night, I think I see a greenish glow far away, as if something is watching me. And the strangest thing is, every time I stop at that same rest area, always during the day now, my GPS freezes for exactly 7 minutes, no matter how many times I restart the device. I never told this story to anyone but you. I know it sounds crazy, but after being on the road for so long, I've learned that there are things that we simply can't explain. I just hope that whatever happened that night, it ended there. Even though deep down, I know they're still out there, somewhere in the darkness, looking for their next subject